Welcome to 60 Skills, and today we're talking about why traditions die. This is a five-parter that is going to cover issues of elites versus systems, or what I like to call there can be only one, a lack of utility, innovation replacing older systems, and the issue of ego and laziness in this whole mess, and of course everybody's favorite topic, financial support. Okay, so the first part of this I like to entitle There Can Be Only One. In a lot of traditional systems of meditation, yoga, martial arts, alchemy, magic, you name it, they are set up such that there is only one person who is ultimately given the whole system. This individual is usually chosen in advance and receives quite a bit of attention from the association. Well, here's the problem with that approach. What happens if they die? Or they just don't care? You see this a lot in traditional martial arts, particularly out of China, where one individual is nominated as the successor. And they beat that child, and by beating I mean in some cases literally beat them, for years on end so that they develop the whole skill set associated with the school. Well, that kid grows up, becomes a teenager, you still force him through it, finally graduates high school, is living his normal day-to-day life, and then decides he doesn't want to have anything to do with this. What happens then? A lot of times these things simply die off. In some cases, they'll come back to it later on in life, but then you end up learning from somebody who A, hasn't done it in a really long time, and B, may not be able to teach it properly because, quite frankly, they're just too old. In many of these more physical systems, once you get past your 50s or early 60s, the amount of personal energy and time required to truly train your successor may just not be in the offering. And keep in mind, frequently things are set up this way for financial reasons, and we'll get to that at the end of the discussion. Now, some systems are set up as systems that anybody can learn. In theory, you have things like the Golden Dawn material. That's assuming all of the materials involved in learning the system actually get released. And as far as I know, only one book was ever written that took you beyond the planets into the zodiac and into the Sephiroth in a systemic manner involving that system. And it's currently out of print and goes for about $700 a copy. And oh, by the way, the guy who wrote it all down doesn't actively teach. Okay, next we come to the issue of a lack of utility, or what I like to call the problem no longer exists. A lot of these systems were invented in a time in which firearms didn't exist, modern medicine didn't exist, refrigeration didn't exist, modern pharmacology didn't exist. So once these things exist, why would you necessarily go on doing this? So take a system like Xing Yi Chuan of Chinese martial arts. Well, Xing Yi Chuan, depending upon who you ask, was actually organized around spear fighting. Now, it's survived as long as it has because firearms weren't introduced into mainland China until relatively recently in terms of human history. But how many people do you see fighting it out in the streets with spears today? Not too many. The result of which is a lot of the utility that originally existed behind the system no longer exists. The result of which is people don't tend to practice it as much anymore. Sure, you have lots of historical reenactors who reenact Civil War battles in the US, but there's no real practical utility in what they're doing. So it'll always be the realm of a tiny minority of enthusiasts. Same thing with black powder shooting competitions. It's fun, but because there's no real practical application for what's going on, you don't necessarily get the best and the brightest. And if you think it applies just to pastimes like this, keep this in mind. Traditionally, if you wanted to be employed in a Western country, you had to work in industry, in the military, in government, in education, so on and so on, for at least a few years until you built your skill set up enough so that you could branch off and do something on your own and be considered credible. Thanks to the internet revolution, this is no longer the case. The very best and brightest of our young people these days, they go on TikTok, they go on YouTube, they do internet marketing. They're off to the races and they've never actually worked in society, which means society doesn't even get the benefit of their labor for very long or for very often. So what happens when everybody who's working in your government, in industry, in academia is second best? Because the brightest of the bunch ran off and became independent years ago and never even bothered. A curious question, but one that's important. Next, we come to the issue of innovation replacing older systems. Two great examples come to mind. One, let's take the martial arts. Right now in the West, the leading, predominant, dominant method of martial arts is mixed martial arts, MMA. There are a bunch of reasons for this, one of which is you can make some money at it if you're a really good athlete. But the other reason being is it works. You spend 6 months, year and a half in an MMA school that doesn't beat you up too badly, and you'll be able to physically handle yourself against 99.99999% of humans walking around planet Earth at any one time. Whereas you could study karate, taekwondo, judo, many of these other more traditional arts, let alone Xingyi, Baguazhang, or Tai Chi, for decades and still never actually be able to defend yourself. MMA has taken over. The result of which is the kung fu craze of the 70s and 80s that I witnessed as a young man has basically gone away. Really very much to the detriment of the people who spent years and in some cases decades of their lives learning how to do this stuff. Basically, nobody cares anymore. Making a living as a Tai Chi master outside the interwebs is a really hard thing to do. Hard in general. Why? If you want exercise, go to the gym. If you want to know how to fight, go learn MMA. Why should you bother? Again, I'm not saying these things have no value. What I am saying is that things have come along that replaced the primary reason for why these other arts exist, and they are definitively better at performing that thing. You see this in medicine all the time. Traditional medicine. I have a degree in acupuncture, for example. Acupuncture is great, but Western medicine treats a lot more things much more effectively. Now, there's still a role for acupuncture and herbalism, particularly for those conditions that Western medicine doesn't have an answer for. But traditional medicine ceased being the predominant method of addressing things, even in the West, about 100 years ago. You know, the Carnegie Foundation released a really interesting report on this that you can get online for free or for I think 99 cents, where it talks about the study that they did to determine how to structure medicine in the US based off of what the best medical colleges in Europe were doing at the time. It's a really interesting read and well worth exploring. Okay, next we get into the issue of my favorite part, ego and laziness. The sad matter or fact is most high-level performers in meditation, yoga, magic, traditional martial arts, you name it, generally have some level of genetic gift at it. They're naturally clairvoyant, they're naturally clairaudient, their physical proprioception is off the charts, so they're really good at moving their body around. So they never really had to go the extra distance to be good. And this is where you get into the old saying that people who are good teachers are rarely the best performers, and the best performers can almost never actually teach. Now, you see this in professional sports too. It's very rare for someone to become a Michael Jordan or a Larry Bird who go on to coach successfully at a pro level. It almost never happens. And it's not just a result of a lack of opportunity. Most of your coaches on a pro NBA team were usually journeymen or guys who barely got into the league as a pro. But because of that, they had to be very good at figuring out how to do things, hence their value as a coach. Now, where this comes into what we do here with the esoteric, a lot of your better practitioners out there are just born with certain gifts that make their doing things like being a medium or being an energy transmission specialist, so on and so forth, relatively easy to the amount of effort required. The result of which is, in many cases, they don't actually know how to teach what they do. They just practiced a whole lot. One morning they woke up and they could do something. My favorite example of this is the Qigong yogic flying ability. There is a man out of Taiwan by the name of He Han who can actually do this. But if you talk to him about how he learned how to do it, he doesn't really have a good answer. He just says, I practiced intensely every day for about 20 years, and all of a sudden I could do it. He doesn't actually know the individual mechanisms behind how he got it to work. And this is not an insult on him, by the way. It's merely a statement that in many cases, people can't explain what they do. Now, this also gets into the final point I'm about to make, but the result of which is taking the time and effort to break everything down, to really look at things, figure out its constituent steps, put it together in a way that most people would understand. That's asking a lot. I mean, a whole lot. It takes a really long time, it takes a lot of effort, and it may simply not be worth someone's time at the end of the day. I had this discussion not too long ago with a friend who's an alchemist out of Europe. We were talking about the merits of having to figure out things on your own, and that's certainly there. The problem with alchemy is every generation we are essentially reinventing algebra because we refuse to formalize the processes and write them down in a clear manner that's easy to understand. The result of which, though, is that you never get to calculus. Think about that for a moment. And finally, we get to the issue of what I call financial support or financial viability. If something isn't really considered all that practical, and it takes a lot of time and it's hard to do, most people aren't going to put many resources into it. And this is a particular problem we have in the West. If you talk to a Tibetan, they'll tell you in terms of esoteric practice, you have yogis and you have lamas. And the yogis are better than the lamas. But the yogis are all poor because nobody's supporting them. The lamas, on the other hand, aren't as good, but because they're part of these massive religious organizations, there is community support for what they're doing. So you're in a weird position where the works of the best practitioners are rarely remembered, yet the people who can, in fact, record what to do and write things down and establish schools and so on and so forth aren't the best at what they do. So this is where eventually finance, and I know people here don't like to hear this, decides what survives and what doesn't. In the West, we're particularly handicapped by the fact that openly operating mystery schools have not been a thing, particularly one that receives state support, since the Inquisition, starting about 600 years ago. So the fact that a lot of the things that we do have survived at all is actually quite remarkable. And I've talked about this before. Part of this comes from the fact that you have to write everything down. But keep in mind, a lot of systems die because lacking utility and lacking interest and lacking support from the general population, nobody's paying for it anymore. And this, again, is not strictly isolated to what esoteric practitioners do. Due to demographic changes, we don't need as many colleges in the West as we used to. Programs are closing all across Western Europe and all across North America. What happens when money runs out for conservatories? At what point do we stop teaching classical piano skills? At what point do we stop teaching classical composers? And hey, this happens in engineering too. We've forgotten as societies in recent years how to do some of the higher end processing required for nuclear works. These literally had to be reinvented within the last decade because everybody retired and everybody stopped making these things. We were able to do that because as societies, the people who had figured out how to do this had only just recently left the workforce. What happens when there's a 100-year gap in between? I mean, we only recently think we've figured out how the magic of Roman concrete works. A little bit of lime and some other stuff. But maybe we haven't. I mean, we still don't really know how the pyramids were built. And there's a lot of crazy talk, conjecture about that, but ultimately, it's a bit of a mystery. So, if you like the topic of today's discussion, give us a like down below and consider subscribing to the channel. And if you would like to learn more about all of this, come check out 60skills.com. Otherwise, as per usual, train hard and be well.